Alarms tore through the corridor before I even had my boots laced. Red light washed over the steel walls of Kethrel Station, and a voice on the intercom said the words, "No cadet ever wants to hear in their first real posting. Hull breach on Deck 4. Hostiles inside the perimeter." I grabbed my sidearm and ran, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. Smoke curled from a ruptured vent above me. Somewhere behind that smoke, boots were pounding toward me, fast and heavy, and they were not friendly boots. I turned a corner and froze. 3 raiders stood between me and the emergency hatch, armored in dull gray plating, weapons already raised. My mind went blank. Every drill I had ever practiced disappeared from my head at once, replaced with nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then a hand closed around my shoulder and pulled me back so hard I stumbled. A tall, quiet man stepped in front of me without a word. Silver hair, calm eyes. The same soldier I had spent 2 months laughing at in front of the entire garrison. He did not shout. He did not hesitate. He moved like the chaos around him was simply weather he had walked through 100 times before, and within seconds, 2 of the raiders were down, and the third had already decided that running was the smarter choice. The whole exchange lasted less time than it takes to describe it. He turned to check on me, pressing 2 fingers briefly to my wrist to count my pulse, completely unbothered by the fact that a plasma graze had just seared across his side. Blood soaked through his uniform, dark and spreading, and he looked at it the way most people look at a spilled drink. "You are fine," he said. "Panic later. Debrief first." I could not speak. 2 months of insults I had thrown at this man rose up in my throat and turned to ash. I had called him old. I had called him a relic. I had called him a burden the fleet was too polite to retire. And here he was, bleeding, having just saved my life without so much as raising his voice. His name was Daniel Marsh, and 3 days later, I would learn something about him that would take the ground out from under me completely. My name is Alira Voss, and my mother is War Master Grace Doyle, the woman who once broke an entire siege line with nothing but grit and a half-wrecked cruiser. I grew up hearing her name spoken like a blessing in every mess hall from here to the outer ring. I grew up believing that toughness looked like her, sharp-jawed and unshaken, never once asking for help, because she never seemed to need it. When I arrived at Kethrel Station for my first posting, I expected to prove myself among warriors who looked the part. Instead, on my very first day, the recruiters marched a group of new arrivals through the training yard, and among them stood a man who looked like he belonged anywhere except a battlefield. Silver hair, a slight limp he never explained, eyes the color of old rust, tired and unreadable. I laughed before I could stop myself. "That one?" I said to the cadets beside me, loud enough for half the yard to hear. "Are we running out of soldiers, or did grandfather here wander in from the retirement wing by mistake?" The laughter that followed felt like currency, and I was hungry for it. Being the daughter of a legend meant living under a shadow so large that I spent every day trying to carve out light of my own. Mocking the slow-looking newcomer felt like an easy way to do it. He did not even glance my way. That silence stung worse than any comeback could have. "Careful, cadet," he said, still not looking at me. "Mouths get people hurt out here faster than blades do." "Is that a threat, veteran?" I shot back, feeling clever. "It is a Tuesday," he said, and walked past me like I was nothing more than wind against his coat. I made it my quiet mission after that to remind everyone exactly how unimpressive I found him. During drills, I called him Fossil under my breath, just loud enough for others to hear. During meals, I asked if the medical bay kept a special chair reserved for him. When the officers paired us for a joint boarding exercise, I told my squad within his hearing that the fleet must be desperate to stick children with retirees. He never lost his temper. He corrected my footwork twice without a single unkind word, adjusting the angle of my stance so smoothly I barely noticed until the movement suddenly felt right. Once, during a live simulation, he pulled me sideways half a second before a blast radius would have marked me dead, and said nothing about it afterward. I resented that silence more than I would have resented an insult, because it meant I owed him something I had no interest in admitting. Then came the morning of the breach, and every insult I had thrown at him collapsed under the weight of what he actually was. That night, I sat across from my mother at dinner and barely touched my food. She noticed immediately, the way she noticed everything, and set down her fork with the patience of someone who already suspected what was coming. "Who is Daniel Marsh?" I asked. My mother went very still. It was the kind of stillness I had never once seen in her. Not during storms, not during drills, not even during the anniversary of the battle that had nearly taken her life. Her hands, usually steady enough to hold a blade without a tremor, wrapped slowly around her cup, as though she needed something solid to hold on to. "Marsh," she repeated softly, testing the name like it belonged to another lifetime entirely. "Where did you hear that name?" "He is stationed here," I said. "Garrison duty. I have been giving him a hard time since I arrived." "A hard time," she echoed, and something flickered behind her eyes that I could not quite name. "That man is the reason I came home from the Threshold campaign at all." I sat up straighter. "What do you mean?" "He walked into a collapse point when 3 full fleets had already turned back," she said, her voice low and careful, like each word cost her something. "He carried half his unit out on his own back. He carried me out when I could not stand. He did not let go of my hand until the medics forced him to." I could not breathe properly. "Mother," I said slowly, "why does this matter right now, after all these years?" She looked at me the way you look at something you have protected so carefully that you forgot to explain why it needed protecting in the first place. "Because," she said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper, "he is your father." The room seemed to tilt. Every insult I had thrown at that quiet, unimpressive-looking man came rushing back to me at once, and each one felt like a stone dropped into my stomach. Fossil, relic, burden. I had said those words to my own father without knowing it, while he stood there and let me, choosing silence over an explanation he could have used to shut me up in an instant. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake replaying every sharp word, every mocking glance, every time he had simply walked past me without reacting. By morning, I could not stay in my bunk any longer. I found him on the observation deck, staring out at the slow-turning rings beyond the station, his side still bandaged from the day before, standing upright, because sitting still had apparently never once occurred to him in his life. "I have questions," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "I imagine you do," he answered without turning around. "You knew this whole time," I said. "Every insult, every single thing I said to you. You knew, and you said nothing." "I did," he admitted. There was no anger in his voice, only a kind of tired honesty. "Why?" I asked. "Why would you let your own daughter treat you like that?" He finally turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw something soft behind those tired, rust-colored eyes. "Because you were not ready to hear it," he said. "And because I did not want respect handed to you through a title. I wanted you to see something worth respecting on its own, without my name attached to it. A reputation is easy to give a child, earning one is not." I felt tears building, and fought them back. "I am sorry," I said. It felt like such a small thing to offer him. "I know," he said gently. "Sit down, cadet. Your footwork is still wrong, and I am not finished making you dangerous yet." I sat, and for the first time since he had arrived on this station, I did not argue with a single word he said. 3 weeks passed, and something between us shifted in ways too small for anyone else to notice, but large enough to change how I moved through the day. I no longer mocked him during drills. I asked questions instead, and he answered them, slowly opening a door that had been closed for 19 years. He taught me how to read tension in a room before it turned violent, how to steady my breathing when panic tried to climb up my throat, how to stand my ground without needing to prove anything to anyone watching. Then the alert came again, this time far larger than a single boarding party. A raider fleet had been tracking supply routes near the outer ring for weeks, and Kethril Station sat directly in their path. When the first warning flashed across every screen on the station, my stomach dropped in a way it never had during simple drills. This was not a simulation. This was not a small breach we could handle in a single corridor. 3 full raider vessels had dropped out of transit space less than an hour from the station. Weapons already charged, formation already locked into an attack pattern our sensors had never logged before. The commanding officers scrambled every available unit into position. I found myself assigned to a defense line near the lower docking bay, standing shoulder to shoulder with cadets, who looked as frightened as I felt. Daniel was placed several corridors away, coordinating a secondary defense point with a handful of veteran soldiers, and for the first time since learning the truth about him, the thought of being separated from him during a real fight sent a jolt of fear through me that had nothing to do with the enemy. The first vessel struck the outer shielding within minutes. The entire station shuddered violently, throwing several cadets off their feet. Emergency lights flickered before steadying into a dim red glow. Somewhere above us, metal groaned under stress it was never built to survive. I gripped my weapon and forced my breathing to slow the way Daniel had taught me. In through the nose, hold, release slowly through the mouth. My hands stopped shaking just enough to keep my aim steady when the first wave of raiders breached the docking bay doors. They came through fast, more organized than the small boarding party from weeks earlier, moving in coordinated pairs that suggested real training behind their aggression. My squad held the line as best we could, but within minutes, 2 of my fellow cadets had fallen back with injuries, and the raiders kept pressing forward, unwilling to slow down. A voice crackled through my earpiece, calm and familiar despite the chaos surrounding it. "Alira, fall back to the secondary corridor. Do not hold ground you cannot keep." It was Daniel, watching the defense grid from wherever he stood, somehow tracking my position among a dozen chaotic signals at once. I wanted to argue, wanted to prove that I could hold my line without help, but the memory of his calm voice during the earlier breach steadied something inside me, and I gave the order to retreat instead of digging in stubbornly, the way I might have done a month earlier. The retreat saved what remained of my squad. Minutes later, reinforcements arrived to seal the corridor we had abandoned, trapping a portion of the raider force between 2 defense lines. It was not a victory yet, but it bought precious time, and for the first time since the alert sounded, I allowed myself to believe we might actually hold the station. Then a second wave struck, this time aimed directly at the section where Daniel was stationed. My earpiece crackled with static, then silence. I called his name twice with no response. Something cold settled into my chest, colder than any fear I had felt facing the raiders myself. I broke formation without waiting for permission, sprinting through smoke-filled corridors toward the last known coordinates of his position, ignoring the shouted warnings from my commanding officer behind me. I found the corridor collapsed halfway, support beams bent at angles that should not have been possible, sparks raining down from a severed power conduit above. Through the wreckage, I spotted movement, and my heart lifted, before immediately dropping again when I saw the state he was in. Daniel knelt beside a fallen soldier, applying pressure to a wound with one hand while holding his weapon steady with the other, covering the narrow gap in the collapsed corridor against 3 raiders attempting to push through. He was pinned, outnumbered, and running out of options, his usual calm now edged with something I had never seen on his face before, a flicker of genuine strain. I did not think. I raised my weapon and moved into position beside him, covering the angle he could not reach alone. Together we forced the raiders back through the gap, buying enough time for reinforcements to arrive and seal the breach completely. When the corridor finally fell silent, Daniel turned to look at me, breathing hard, blood staining his sleeve from a fresh wound along his forearm. "You were supposed to fall back," he said, though there was no real anger behind the words, only exhaustion and something that looked dangerously close to pride. "You taught me not to hold ground I could not keep," I said, echoing his own words back to him. This ground was worth keeping. He almost smiled then, a small tired curve at the corner of his mouth that told me more than any words could have. We helped the wounded soldier to his feet between us and made our way back toward the main defense line, where the remaining raider vessels had already begun retreating under the combined pressure of the station's counterattack. By the time the all-clear signal finally echoed through the corridors, the sun had nearly risen over the distant curve of the rings outside, though inside the station, there was no true day or night, only the steady rhythm of emergency lights slowly shifting back to their normal glow. Cadets and veterans alike gathered in the main hall, exhausted, some injured, all of them alive. I found Daniel near the medical bay, refusing a stretcher despite the insistence of the medics around him, arguing that he could walk perfectly well on his own. Some things about him, I realized, would probably never change no matter how much time passed. "You could have told me sooner," I said, sitting down beside him, while a medic finally forced him into a chair long enough to treat his arm. "Told you what?" he asked, though the small knowing look in his eyes told me he already understood exactly what I meant. "That you were my father, that you watched me grow up from somewhere far away, and never said a word about it, even when I mocked you to your face for 2 straight months." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the medic wrap a bandage around his forearm with practiced efficiency. "I made a promise a long time ago," he finally said, "that if I ever got the chance to know you, I would let you choose whether I mattered to you or not. Not because of blood, because of who I actually was standing in front of you. And now?" I asked quietly. "Now," he said, looking directly at me for the first time since we had sat down, "you get to decide that for yourself. I am not asking for anything more than that." I thought about the 2 months of insults I had thrown his way, the quiet patience he had shown in return, the moment he stepped between me and 3 armed raiders without a single word of hesitation, and the corridor where I had run toward danger instead of away from it, because the thought of losing him terrified me more than the raiders ever could. "I already have decided," I said. "I do not need more time to figure it out." He studied my face for a long moment, searching for something, and whatever he found there seemed to settle something long unresolved behind his tired, rust-colored eyes. "Good," he said simply, and for the first time since I had met him, his voice carried something warmer than mere calm, something that sounded almost like relief. Word of the battle spread quickly through the station over the following days, and with it came whispers about the quiet garrison soldier who had held a collapsing corridor alone against overwhelming odds. Nobody outside my mother and myself knew the full truth of who he was, and for now, that felt right. Some things did not need an audience to matter. My mother arrived on the station 3 days later, summoned by news of the attack, and when she saw Daniel standing steady despite his bandaged arm, something passed between them that no words could have properly captured. 19 years of silence and distance, folding quietly into a single shared glance across a crowded hallway. I watched them from a distance, my mother, and the quiet man I had spent 2 months underestimating, and understood for the first time that toughness did not always look like broken siege lines and unshaken jaws. Sometimes, it looked like patience. Sometimes it looked like silence held for the sake of someone else's growth. Sometimes it looked like a tired, unimpressive man standing calmly in the middle of chaos, willing to be mocked for months rather than force a truth his daughter was not yet ready to carry. I had spent my whole life trying to prove I belonged in my mother's shadow. It took nearly losing my father to understand that the strength I actually needed had been standing quietly beside me the entire time, waiting patiently for me to notice it on my own.